Greetings, family, and welcome to the African Exodus show. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie, here to you with a new video. Before we get started with today's video, I want to remind you all, if you have not already, please do add yourself to my Telegram channel. That is a decentralized app that I use in order to update you all whenever I post a new video. So you can subscribe to that at the link down below. Are Africans cursed? This is something that has been peddled for a long time inside of Christianity, something that has been propagated through Christianity and Judaism, and even Islam. The idea that the African race is cursed on earth, that is why you see all of the suffering throughout the African continent. That's why you see the suffering throughout the diaspora, because we are a cursed people. We're going to talk about this. We're going to actually use scripture to qualify whether or not that is true. And we're going to do so in order to dispel a myth. That is that there is a such thing as a curse of Ham. Let me tell you, there is no such thing as a curse of Ham as far as the scripture. However, there is a curse of Ham outside of scripture that has been attached to the scripture. And because of that, the European enslaver and also other such parties that will remain nameless as they are considered untouchable, such parties are going to use that as a way to legitimize their power throughout the world. So let's talk about this curse of Ham. Genesis 9 is really the scripture that people point to as saying that there is such thing as a curse of Ham. So let's talk about this scripture. This is after the flood has happened, and Noah, is according to the scripture, began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside of his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both their soldiers and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his younger son had done to him. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be Yahuwah, the Elohim of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant, and may Elohim enlarge the Japheth, and may he live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." Now we're going to not talk about the Japheth being in the tents of Shem in this particular video. I'm sure we can talk about it in another video. But that scripture that I read, that has been the precipice of a long history of the demonization of African people, the demonization of the descendants of Ham, who will find out it's a little more complex than what people want to admit it is. But it's been a long history of a demonization. Now, it's important for you to notice, at least in this scripture, there's no mention of black inside of the scripture, obviously. Now, there is scripture inside of Apocrypha that says Noah was an albino, but of course, albino is still an African. You only get albino out of having a skin that's other than white. Noah himself was not white. We also know that Noah had three sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. None of them were differentiated by color. So the idea that one was a certain color and one was not, that is, again, historical misrepresentations put into place by people in power to control a people. Where we get this is not inside of Holy Scripture. Where we get this is actually inside of a book called the Babylonian Talmud. Now, you have to understand that there is a war inside of the spiritual systems, and one war is inside of the system called Torah. There is Torah that is written, and then there is a so-called Torah that is not written, and they call this the Babylonian Talmud. It's important that you understand that these are warring factions, because one faction has the upper hand as far as controlling the narrative inside of the international system, controlling the history of a people. That faction has been elevated, and that is the faction that upholds the Babylonian Talmud as being the history, or not just the history, scripture, the same as the written Bible. So if you did not know that, understand, while those of us who hold that the Torah is only what has been written inside of the scripture, the laws of Yahuwah, there's another faction of those who say they follow Torah, who have added to the original words of Yahuwah, and they have added so with what we call the Babylonian Talmud, what is known throughout the world whenever you're dealing with the untouchable people. This is known as scripture, or held as scripture by the majority of them. So we're going to read from this one article. It says, a Jewish etiology on the origin of black skin is found in a rabbinic source, redacted before the mid-6th century in the name of the authorities of the 3rd and 4th centuries. God prohibited Noah's family and all creatures in the ark from engaging in sex during the flood, but Noah's son Ham, the dog, and the raven transgressed the prohibition and had sexual relations with respective partners. Playing on the assumed etymology of Ham, the story claims that Ham turned black as punishment for his sins. That is from the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 108b, Goldberg, Curse of Ham 102 to 107, and 186 to 187. In addition to the Jewish source, this sex in the ark story is commonly found in Muslim sources and in at least one Christian source from the East, Isho-Dad. We also find it in Christian literature from the West, beginning in the 13th century. So what should be emphasized, and again, to read the actual scripture, let me rephrase that. The actual words of the Babylonian Talmud, that is not scripture, but it actually says, 3 violated the directive, engaged in intercourse while in the ark. All of them were punished for doing so. The dog, the raven, and Ham, son of Noah. The dog was punished in it, and it is bound. The raven was punished, and it spits. And Ham was afflicted in that his skin turned black. Now, this is written a long time after, if you use the word canon, you could say after the canon finished, meaning after the words, the scriptures that are in the Bible, a long time after the Bible. This is written between 450 CE and 550 CE. So about 300 years after the scriptures that we know today as of the Bible, after they were written. Way longer, obviously, than after Genesis was written. A community comes to add to the words and to give an interpretation. We can speculate why said community did so. Now, I want you to know that there is more to the curse of Ham than what is in Genesis. And this goes back to the issue of scriptures that were not in the Bible, or scriptures that were taken out of the Bible by people who have said they have authority to determine what is scripture and what is not. And those people, those flesh and blood human beings that are not divine in any sense of the word divine, those people have for long have kept many of the people in Christianity in the dark about what is true and what is false. And we get some important information, though, as far as modern times, because of things that we call apocrypha, but also because of a discovery called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we're not going to get into all of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a huge subject, one that I'm still studying, to be frank. But you should understand this archaeological discovery because it is, many would say, the most significant of the modern era. So, to read from this article, Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient, mostly Hebrew manuscripts, and this is from Britannica, by the way, of leather, papyrus, and copper, first found in 1947 on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is among the most important finds in history of modern archaeology. The scrolls discovered at Qumran are certainly the best known of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they are not the only scrolls that have been found. Thus, to know what are the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is necessary to take a wider look. While at Qumran, I don't know why I have problems with this word, the Qumran scrolls are the most numerous. Hundreds of scrolls fragments have been found in several other sites in the Jordan Valley and Judean desert. These texts date from the 8th century BCE to the 7th century CE and record the life and activities of the people who lived in and passed through these regions. While scrolls from Qumran are in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, other scrolls are in Latin, Arabic, and Nabatean. Now, it's important to know that the scrolls were discovered inside of Palestine. There's always been a community of Hebrews in Palestine, although Palestine is not biblical Yasharel as far as archaeology, as far as geographical borders, it's not. But there's always been a community there, which is why it was easier for certain people to pass the lie that this is actually Israel. Now, we're going to talk about one segment of the Dead Sea Scrolls, one that they probably don't want you to read. That is Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q252. This is called the Genesis Apocrypha. On that day went forth from the ark at the end of a full year of 364 days, on the first day of the week, and on the 7th of the month. Vacat, when you see Vacat, understand these are scrolls and there are fragments missing from the scrolls. But by the miracle, the grace of Yahuwah, he has honestly allowed certain segments that are very relevant to us today to remain present inside of the scrolls. So anytime I say Vacat, that's a part of the scroll that is no longer in existence. So it says, and on the second month, Vacat, and on the 6th Vacat, Noah from the ark at the appointed time of a full year, Vacat. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers. But he did not curse him, but only his son. For Yahuwah had blessed the sons of Noah and let them dwell in the tents of Shem. So it literally says right here that he did not curse Ham, he cursed Canaan. Now, many people wonder, why did Noah curse Canaan to begin with? And to be clear, I don't know, meaning like there's nothing in scripture that tells us exactly why. But there are things that you can actually draw from other scripture that explains it better, I think, or gives you an idea. I look at the curse of Canaan, honestly, not just as a condemnation of Ham for his acts, but I honestly look at it as a prophecy that Noah foresaw. And I believe that because of the book of Jubilees. So we're going to read from the book of Jubilees. This particular part of Jubilees, this is after the entire known world was apportioned. Not all of the world was apportioned from Noah, from his sons, but generally what we call the Western Hemisphere was apportioned. And we get to find out which part of the earth was allotted to which people, which tribe, which son of Noah. Now in Jubilees, we read in chapter 10, verse 28. And Ham and his sons went into the land which he was to occupy, and he acquired as his portion in the land of the south. And Canaan saw that the land of Lebanon to the river of Egypt, that it was very good. And he went not into the land of his inheritance to the west, that is to the sea. And he dwelt in the land of Lebanon, eastward and westward from the border of Jordan and from the border of the sea. And Ham his father and Cush and Mizraim his brothers said unto him. Now let me repeat this. Ham, Cush, Mizraim, who is the ancestor of what we know as Egypt. They said to Canaan, Thou hast settled in a land which is not thine, and which did not fall to us by lot. Do not do so. For if thou dost do so, thou and thy sons will fall in the land and be accursed through sedition. For by sedition ye have settled, and by sedition will thy children fall, and thou shalt be rooted out forever. Dwell not in the dwelling of Shem, for to Shem and to his sons did it not fall by their lot. Cursed art thou, and cursed shalt thou be beyond all of the sons of Noah, by the curse by which we bound ourselves by an oath in the presence of the holy judge, and in the presence of Noah our father. But he did not hearken unto them, and dwelt in the land of Lebanon from Hamath to the entering of Egypt, he and his sons until this day. And for this reason, that land's name is named Canaan. So a bunch of things to emphasize from here. Number one, once again, we see a people who make a vow or who make an agreement and go back on that agreement, and how Yahuwah treats that. We talked about it in the introduction to Esau, and I'm sure we're going to get more into that. That is what Canaan did that was very vow, and for that reason, he would be cursed. He knew that he had a certain allotment of the earth, but rather than go with what he was given, he decided to go into Shem's territory and occupy a part of that territory. This map that I'm showing you right now, if you were to read Jubilees, and I hope all of you have, particularly Jubilees 9, where you get the details, 8 and 9, where you get the details of the allotment of the earth. When you look at this map, you will see who had which territory. Now, this is according to Jubilees, not according to tyranny. This is literally according to this ancient scripture that was held as scripture for all of the history of the Torah. This was held as scripture by even the early Christian community according to the book of Jubilees, this is what the allotment looked like. What you see right here is that Japheth obviously occupies the north, as we all knew, cutting through parts of Arabia, or parts of what we know as the Middle East. Shem occupies some parts of the Middle East, or what we know as the Middle East or Arabia, some parts of Asia, but for the most part, his territory is really inside of what we call Africa. Now, how is it that Africans are cursed if Shem's allotment was actually not just parts that we call Arabia, although much of Arabia is on the African tectonic plates. So for all intents and purposes, it is Africa. But not just that he occupied this area, he is part of Shem's allotment is inside of the continent of Africa. So how could Black people, dark skin, be associated with Ham? If you understand particularly not just Shem's region, how the indigenous people looked in that region, and particularly as you go more south, even into today, all Black people, all dark people. So who changed the meaning of the scripture to say that Shem and Japheth were not Black and that Ham was Black? I give you a clue, probably the same people who wanted to hide the fact that they were not a descendant of Shem. Probably the same people who wanted to hide the fact that Israel was not where they said it was. Probably people who wanted to distance even Palestine from being a part of the African continent by depicting it as a place called the Middle East that is separate and apart from the African tectonic plate as we know it is apart. So this is an agenda, is what I'm trying to point out. If you buy into the idea that the Bible curses Ham, you're buying it into an agenda, whether you take it in a positive or negative light, whether you take it as a means to propagate hate against Africans, or whether you take it as a means to negate the scripture as being something legitimate for African people. Also want to point out to you the part of the earth that, and I think it's relevant, the part of the earth where Canaan was allotted. That is where you go to the far west, northwest Africa. So when you're looking at Algeria, when you're looking at Morocco, all of this area up to the north of Africa, northwest of Africa, that was supposed to be Canaan's allotment. And it makes sense when you look at where his allotment was, northern Mali, all of these areas. When you look at this area, it's a very dry area, which also tells you why Canaan decided to look elsewhere. This is a lot of what we call the Sahara Desert. So this region becomes relevant in the future of conflicts with nations, and we're not going to get into that today. But I did just want to give you a heads up that region holds a lot of significance. We're not going to get into that today, but I just wanted to point that out to you, that we'll see this region become significant in the near future. So that is it for this video. I hope that that was insightful. Definitely check all my sources. Please do. And I will see you all in the next video.
It seems to me that Jewish involvement then in that transatlantic slave trade precedes by many, many years, perhaps by 1,000 years, the actual beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And let me explain. It seems to me that the most important theoretical underpinning for that transatlantic slave trade was what has come to be known in many quarters as the Hamitic myth. Some people call it the curse of Ham story. When the slave trade developed, beginning in 1441 and for hundreds of years thereafter, people who prosecuted that trade looked around for intellectual justification, for rationalizations, for pretexts, if you will. And a variety of pretexts were advanced to justify the slave trade, to allow people to sleep well at night, for their consciences to be clear. One justification was that Africans were heathens. They weren't Christian, they were heathens, and therefore it was all right to enslave heathens. It would not be all right to enslave one's Christian brother, but it would be okay. It would be morally justifiable to enslave a heathen. That was one kind of rationale that was advanced to justify the slave trade. Another rationale was that Africans were less than human. Africans were devoid of reason, could not reason. Were a subspecies of creature. They weren't human, and therefore again, whereas there might have been some moral opprobrium attached to enslaving one's fellow human beings, in the case of Africans, since they weren't quite human, that kind of treatment of Africans was okay. The authority for this idea was said to reside in the book of Genesis, in the story in the book of Genesis. Now, there's a story in the book of Genesis, and there's an interpretation of that story that allowed it to be used to justify African slavery, and they're two different things. The story in Genesis is in Genesis. It's been in the Bible ever since. But the sort of spin that was put on that story that enabled it to become the basis for the Hamitic myth actually comes out of the Talmud, the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. Somewhere around 500 AD or thereabouts, the Babylonian Talmud. Let me just describe the difference between the story as it appears in the Bible and the story as it was spun in the Talmud. According to the Bible, Noah, after the flood, apparently had a vineyard someplace, and he partook of the wine that was produced out of his vineyard. He got himself drunk one night, went into his tent, took his clothes off, as people often do when they get drunk. And according to the biblical story, he had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham apparently entered the area where his father was lying in his drunken, naked stupor, and Ham, in an act of disrespect, gazed upon his father's nakedness, and apparently went back outside and informed his two other brothers of his father's condition. According to the biblical story, the two other brothers then came inside the tent or wherever, and out of respect for their father, they kind of backed into the tent. They would not look directly at him in his naked condition. They backed into the tent, they covered him with some kind of a garment, and according to the biblical story, when Noah revived, when he, arose from his drunken stupor and realized what had happened, he then cursed Ham's son Canaan and all of his descendants forever, and said that they would be the servants of the descendants of the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Somewhere along the line, I'm not quite sure how come, but somewhere along the line, somebody came up with the notion that Ham was the progenitor of the African race, and Shem was the progenitor of the Asian race, and Japheth was the progenitor of the European race. So Noah had three sons of three different races, and he cursed his African son and their descendants, and said that those descendants would be the slaves, the servants of the Asian branch of the family, and also the European branch of the family forever. And that's as far as the biblical story goes. The Talmud, which of course, my understanding of the Talmud, I'm no expert in the Talmud, but my understanding is that the Talmud consists of interpretations, what they call glosses, on various biblical stories. And these glosses or interpretations or spins are supposed to give people who subscribe to the Judaic religion a sort of an authoritative guide as to how to interpret the biblical stories and whatnot. So what the Talmud did then, the Talmud came along, the Babylonian Talmud, around about 500 or so AD, and proceeded to spin this biblical story, and for reasons that are unknown to me. But Ham, again, was said to be the progenitor of the African race. Now, interestingly enough, I've read someplace that early Christians also accepted this notion of Ham being some sort of progenitor of the African race. But apparently, in the Christian tradition, the kind of, overtly racist implications of that fact didn't develop in the same way as it developed in the Judaic tradition. According to the Talmud, Ham was the original African, and when God, through Noah, cursed Ham and his son Canaan and all his descendants, he was in fact cursing the African race. Now, this was the unique new element to the story that the Talmud originated. That the curse on Ham and Canaan was not only a curse on an individual and his family, but it was a curse on a race. So here, this is the contribution then of the Talmud. That God, through Noah, cursed the African race. And the Talmud proceeded to embellish the story in the most delightful, should I say, ways. For example, the Talmud said that there was ample proof that God was in fact cursing the African race. It said, for example, that because Ham had gazed upon Noah's nakedness in the dark of night, that the African race was henceforth turned black, so that the blackness of the African became a sort of a visible indication of that curse. Now, these Jewish rabbis, the sages they call them, wise men who put together this Talmud, they actually invented. I mean, they sort of elaborated on the biblical story. It's like a jazz musician who improvises. Well, they improvised on the story. They did a whole elaborate improvisation in the story, and somehow, Lord knows how come, but they came up with the notion that Ham, when he went into that tent and looked upon his naked father Noah, that Ham buggered his father. He had anal intercourse with his father. And because he had anal intercourse with his father, that's the reason, and here I'm citing Blackman, that's the reason why part of the curse was to give black men large sexual organs. So all of this was part of the curse. The black skin, the big eyes, even the kinky hair too, big sexual organs, all of this. So, as amazing as this may seem, this transpired 1,000 years before the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And when the slave trade came into being, this notion of the Hamitic curse was revived, and it became, both for Jews and for Christians, it became the most pervasive of all the attempts to rationalize that slave trade. Let me quote the exact words of Harold Bachman, lest you suspect that I'm making this up. I'm quoting here from Harold Bachman, the dissertation I mentioned a minute ago, The Ebb and Flow of History. Quote, "There is no denying," this is on page 34 in case anybody who has the book feels like reading along with me. I know several of you have the book on it. This is on page 34 in the middle of the page. Second new paragraph. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source," and listen to how unequivocal he is here. It was the first, the very first. In other words, this is Bachman from the Simon Wiesenthal Center acknowledging that the Talmud was the place that invented the story of the Hamitic curse. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source to read a Negrophobic content into the episode." Here he is referring to the episode of Ham looking upon his father's nakedness. Ham is told by his outraged father that because you have abused me in the darkness of the night, your children shall be born black and ugly. This is in the Talmud. Because you have twisted your head to cause me embarrassment, they shall have kinky hair and red eyes. So if you ever wondered about the origin of the kinky hair and the red eyes of black folk, here you have it. Because your lips jested at my exposure, theirs shall swell. That's why black folks have thick lips. And because you neglected my nakedness, they, that is your children, the children of Ham and Canaan, they shall go naked with their shamefully elongated male members exposed for all to see. So there you have the origin of a whole variety of stereotypes pertaining to Africa. So the Hamitic myth then is where you really have to begin, in terms of a discussion of the Jewish role in the slave trade. They provided the rationale par excellence for the prosecution of that slave trade.